The 8 to 12 rep range is extremely practical for gaining muscle. Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. And when I make that statement, there's going to be a lot of evidence-based people are going to be like, there's no rep range for muscle growth. In fact, all rep ranges show muscle growth, etc. You know what? I agree. I absolutely agree with that point. However, I want to be clear, it makes sense to do a lot of your work in that traditional, what was considered to be the hypertrophy rep range at 8 to 12. And it's not because it magically causes more muscle growth. Okay? I want to be extremely clear on that. It doesn't just magically cause more muscle growth. Okay? In fact, all available evidence shows that 3s can gain muscle, 10s can gain muscle, 20s can gain muscle. We can even make the case, and this is one reason I'm big on power building, is we can make the case for there being very small amounts of evidence, and a lot of experts and researchers have said they think this body of evidence will grow, that different rep ranges may have slightly different pathways. So in other words, doing some very low, some medium, and some very high reps might, over the course of time, produce slightly more muscle growth. Okay? We can make the case for that. So I want to be clear there. We can make the case for that. All right? We can also make the case for the fact that some lower reps may be beneficial to improving neural drive enough to improve overload on your higher reps. We can make the case for some really high reps at 15 to 20, helping burn through more calories for better body composition while still producing good muscle growth. Again, talking about things like EPOC, total calorie burn, using lifting as part of our energy turnover for fat loss. Again, based on studies we have on lifting weights and fat loss. So again, not discounting any of that. We can make good cases for using multiple rep ranges, right? Make a good case for that. But what I'm going to definitely say especially for people somewhat new, spending a lot of time, again, once we get our other big movements out of the way, but I almost feel like I'm at a point where, as a coach, I could prescribe a lot of 5 to 8s for that stuff instead of even those old 5s. Okay, and then do 10 to 12 for secondary exercises, even for novices. Get really good results. Get really good results doing that. I almost want to write some programming based around that. Okay, I almost want to do that, as its own form of power building. Where we focus maybe on some 6s on the big lifts, and then we do a bunch of 10 to 12s for the majority of our work. But that's always going to be the point I make with that. Even for me, as someone who still does some 6s all the time, I do some 5 to 6s every single week, but only on about 4 or 5 lifts at the most. Where do you see most of my work? That 10 to 12. Most of it. And I still do some stuff higher. But I spend a lot of time in that 10 to 12. And we can come back over to kind of saying that 8 because a little bit heavier, a little bit more neural drive. Spending a lot of time there gives you a lot to work with. But here's the other thing to think about. When you're up around that 8 to 12, we can do a lot of volume and handle it. We don't get the same fatigue that we get from the really high reps. And I think especially the reason I say that 8 to 12 is because we're big compounds. And you don't want to do 15 to 20 for some of your big movements. It starts turning into cardio. Any big free weight exercise, even a dumbbell press, right? It starts to turn into that real quick. That's almost reserved for machines in isolation. Realistically, seems to work better there. So again, if we're going to talk a lot of free weight stuff, that 8 to 12 works really well. And a lot of old school bodybuilders figured this out decades ago. Keep that in mind, back before gear was used, right? And even in the era when gear use was more moderate, what did we see? Well, that's exactly what we saw. That's literally what we saw. Everyone stuck around that 8 to 12, and it started being called the hypertrophy range because guys realized that was kind of a sweet spot for volume. It didn't create quite the grueling amount that we got from the really high reps of fatigue, right? Didn't quite create that, although a lot of them would do a lot of the higher when they wanted to get leaner, which again makes sense, more calorie burn, more energy turnover. They would go a little lower when they wanted to get stronger. It's where you saw a lot of the 5s. Okay? A lot of base building was done 5x5s back in the day. Guys just kind of gravitated towards that because they figured out it kind of worked. And I think especially as the years got on, things like bodybuilding grew, you saw more of that. And, people who say, well, it turns out that wasn't true. We've got studies showing that all these rep ranges work. Yeah, absolutely. But guess what? That worked really, really well. It was very effective. It's very effective. And realistically, what sort of training approaches did we see that appeared to be really effective? All right, start looking at the volumes, looking at the frequencies that guys just started gravitating towards because it worked. I'm talking 20, 30, 40 years ago. You saw certain frequencies, certain splits really go in popularity. And then everyone still calls it, well, it's all bro training. But it worked. Guys got really, really jacked. And gals, actually. People produced phenomenal physiques doing it. Okay? They did. It worked. It worked extremely well. Worked extremely well if they wanted to stick to largely one rep range. Whereas, and I tend to tell people we want to stick to multiple rep ranges. This is where the power building type approach works. But how much of that is still done in that range? A pretty good chunk of it. Pretty good chunk of it. Okay? I know I really like to do a lot of 12 to 15, even more and more these days, for me personally. But I still do the heavier stuff too. Okay? So just pointing that out. But traditionally, that 8 to 12 worked because it doesn't beat you up the way the 5 and lower does, right? You don't get beat up because that heavy weight starts beating you up. And you can do it on the big movements with a certain amount of volume, okay? Till you get real strong and you got to limit the volume of it. You can do it and it doesn't beat you up till the volume gets too high. You do it on the smaller movements, it beats you into the ground. Okay, you try to do the really high reps, those 15 to 20s, you start trying to do that stuff on the big movements and it just grades you. It just grinds you into the ground with fatigue. Doesn't beat you up, but it just burns you out. And you start running into cardio problems. Cardiovascular starts limiting you before muscle does. So really, on average, that 8 to 12 is kind of a sweet spot. And it's not that it causes more muscle growth. It's just that it's a practical rep range that works for almost every exercise. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.